King Charles just received the most dangerous message of his reign. And no, it didn't come in a red box from Downing Street, or in a secret cable from Washington or Brussels. It came from his own people, ordinary citizens who decided they'd had enough. It started with something so simple it almost felt like a prank, a banner hanging over a busy British motorway. The words were short, sharp, impossible to misinterpret. Charles, do your job. Fire these traitors. Now, in any other era, maybe that would have been dismissed as a stunt, a one-off act of political theatre. But in 2025 Britain, with trust in Parliament at historic lows, the cost of living crushing households, migration numbers breaking records, and the entire country simmering with frustration, those 6 words detonated like a political bomb. Within hours, photos of that banner were everywhere. Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, even WhatsApp family chats lit up with the image. Memes were made, hashtags created, and suddenly it wasn't just a roadside protest, it was a national rallying cry. The demand was simple, but terrifying in its implications. The king must use his rarely spoken about constitutional powers to dissolve parliament and force new elections. Think about how wild that is. For decades, Britain has operated under the assumption that the monarchy is ceremonial, symbolic, carefully neutral. The Queen shook hands, cut ribbons, and stayed firmly above the political storm. But now, millions are looking to her son, King Charles, and saying, step in. Pick up the crown, swing it like a hammer, and smash the system. And the numbers prove it's not just online noise. Polling shows public approval of Parliament has collapsed to just 19%, the lowest in modern history. The cost of living has soared by 23% in just 2 years. Net migration hit a record high of 764,000. People are exhausted. They've stopped believing the promises of their politicians, and they've stopped waiting for Parliament to fix itself. So, what do you do when you've lost faith in democracy? Apparently, you turn to the monarchy. Social media campaigns calling for dissolution have gained over 50 million views on TikTok alone. Hashtags demanding royal intervention have trended for nearly a week straight. And these aren't just hardcore royalists. These are everyday people, workers, parents, pensioners saying if Parliament won't listen, maybe the king will. Here's where it gets even more explosive. Constitutional experts confirm that Charles actually does have the authority to act. It's buried in something called the royal prerogative, ancient powers, that technically give the monarch the ability to dissolve Parliament in extreme circumstances. Powers that haven't been used since the 1970 seconds. Powers most people assumed had been retired to the history books. But this is not history class anymore. This is the present, and millions believe the moment has arrived, which leaves King Charles in the most dangerous position of his reign. If he actually dissolves Parliament, he triggers the biggest constitutional crisis since the English Civil War. He'll be branded a dictator, the media will explode, allies abroad will panic, and Britain's carefully managed democracy could collapse into chaos. If he does nothing though, the monarchy itself could be fatally wounded. Because why keep a king if he won't step in when the nation is crying out for leadership? Already, polls show that 43% of Britons support the king dissolving Parliament. Among working-class voters, that figure jumps to 67%. And here's the kicker, 38% say if Charles refuses, they'd support abolishing the monarchy altogether. So let's be clear, this isn't a symbolic debate anymore, it's a full-blown constitutional standoff, a king being pushed by his people to wield powers nobody thought he would ever use. A parliament so distrusted that millions would rather bypass it entirely, and a country teetering on the edge of something we haven't seen in centuries. What started as a banner on a motorway has become a bombshell that could decide the fate of the monarchy and the future of British democracy itself. And the clock? It's ticking louder by the day. What began with a single banner quickly erupted into something far bigger, a movement that no one in Britain's political establishment can afford to ignore. Across the country, from Manchester to Birmingham, from Glasgow to Cardiff, the chant was the same: dissolve Parliament now. These weren't radicals or professional activists. They were nurses, builders, pensioners, students, ordinary Britons who feel their government has abandoned them. The frustration has been building for years, through the pandemic, through Brexit fatigue, through rising energy prices and mortgage chaos. And now, finally, it has burst into the open with a demand aimed not at Parliament, but at the monarch himself. The numbers are staggering. Public confidence in Parliament has crashed to just 19%, the lowest ever recorded. Net migration has hit a record 764,000 in 2025. The cost of living has risen 23% in just 2 years. For millions of families, the daily struggle to pay bills and put food on the table has become unbearable. Against that backdrop, the motorway banner didn't look like vandalism. It looked like truth. And that truth resonated with a public that feels ignored and betrayed. The idea of royal intervention spread online like wildfire. TikTok clips explaining the king's constitutional powers racked up tens of millions of views. YouTube creators built entire channels around the concept of royal dissolution, some gaining hundreds of thousands of subscribers almost overnight. Even lifelong monarchists, people who had always insisted that the crown should remain symbolic, started to change their tune. Extraordinary times, they argued, require extraordinary action. But here's where the crisis turns lethal for the monarchy. King Charles does have the power to dissolve Parliament under the royal prerogative, but those powers have not been used since the 1972nd. They are a constitutional relic, buried under decades of tradition that demand royal neutrality. If he acts, Charles could be accused of dictatorship, of smashing centuries of democratic balance. Britain's allies would panic, financial markets would collapse. The carefully maintained illusion of the monarchy as above politics would be shattered. If he does nothing, however, the monarchy could collapse from the inside. Why keep a king who refuses to defend his people at their hour of need? Polls already show 43% of Britons support the king dissolving Parliament. Among working-class voters, that figure jumps to 67%. More dangerously for Buckingham Palace, 38% say they'd support abolishing the monarchy entirely if Charles refuses to act. That is not just pressure, that is a guillotine hanging over the House of Windsor. The international stakes make it even more explosive. European leaders are already expressing quiet alarm. The White House has issued carefully worded statements about Britain's strong democratic traditions, but behind the scenes, officials are terrified that a royal intervention could destabilize global markets. Commonwealth nations like Canada and Australia are watching nervously, knowing that if Charles takes action, it could trigger calls for similar interventions in their own countries. Financial markets are already shaking. The pound has slid, government bonds are volatile, and investors are pulling billions from British assets. In real time, Britain's credibility as a stable democracy is being tested. Inside Buckingham Palace, advisors are split. The traditional courtiers are begging Charles to do nothing, to ride out the storm, to protect the monarchy by staying neutral. But younger voices, many of them closer to public opinion, argue that inaction could be fatal. Neutrality, they warn, is itself a political choice. And in a crisis this deep, neutrality may look like betrayal. Even the military has weighed in. Veterans groups are signing petitions urging the king to step in, arguing their oath was always to the crown, not to Parliament. Trade unions, once fiercely Republican, are openly divided. Religious leaders are warning that silence could cost the monarchy everything. So here is the impossible choice. Act and risk plunging Britain into its worst constitutional crisis since the English Civil War, or refuse and risk ending the monarchy altogether. This is not a decision that can be delayed for long. Every day Charles hesitates, the pressure grows, the anger spreads, and the chants grow louder. Dissolve Parliament now. So here we are. A king boxed in by history, a parliament collapsing under the weight of distrust, and a nation more restless than at any point in living memory. This is not business as usual. This is not a political spat that fades after a news cycle. This is a moment that could redefine Britain for generations, and the decision rests with one man, King Charles. If he chooses to act, to invoke his royal prerogative and dissolve Parliament, the consequences will be immediate and seismic. Parliament will erupt in fury. Politicians across the spectrum will brand him a dictator, a monarch who overstepped the sacred line between ceremonial neutrality and raw political power. The media, both at home and abroad, will explode with headlines about a constitutional crisis. Allies in Washington, Brussels, and Canberra will question Britain's stability. Financial markets will panic, the pound will nosedive, investors will flee, Charles will be painted as reckless, destabilizing, even dangerous. That is one possible future. But if he does nothing, if he hides behind tradition and allows this moment to pass, the monarchy itself could face an even greater threat. Because millions of Britons are watching, waiting, demanding. They are asking a simple question. If the king cannot act when his people are desperate, then what is the point of having a king at all? Polling already shows that nearly half the country supports him dissolving Parliament, and a third are ready to abolish the monarchy altogether if he refuses. That is not a fringe opinion. That is the beginning of an existential crisis for the crown. So neutrality is no longer neutral. Every path Charles takes has consequences. Acting could fracture Britain's democracy. Refusing could destroy the monarchy itself. This is what makes the choice impossible, and why it will define not just his reign, but the very survival of the institution he inherited. And remember, the pressure is not static. It is building, hour by hour, day by day. Protesters are already planning bigger demonstrations, unions are openly debating royal intervention, veterans are signing petitions, and religious leaders are warning that silence could cost the monarchy everything. Social media campaigns are exploding. TikTok videos and YouTube explainers about royal prerogatives are going viral, and hashtags calling for dissolution are trending for a record-breaking stretch. Every delay, every hesitation magnifies the sense that Charles is paralyzed at the very moment his country needs him to move. Meanwhile, the international stage is watching closely. In Brussels, in Washington, in Ottawa, in Canberra, leaders are holding their breath. Some fear chaos, others fear precedent. If Charles dissolves Parliament, what happens in Canada, Australia, or New Zealand, where monarchs technically still hold similar powers? Could his choice ignite a wave of demands for royal intervention across the Commonwealth? Could Britain, once the model of stable democracy, suddenly become the spark that shakes constitutional monarchies worldwide? And let's not forget the cultural weight of this moment. For over 1,000 years, the monarchy has survived by adapting, bending but not breaking, finding ways to remain relevant in the face of wars, revolutions, and modern democracy. Charles knows that his mother, Queen Elizabeth, was respected not because she wielded power, but because she embodied stability. Now, her son faces a test unlike anything she ever endured, a demand from his own people to wield powers thought extinct, to act or to fade, to lead or to watch. Whatever Charles chooses, history will not forget. He will not be remembered for his speeches, his charity projects, or his environmental campaigns. His entire reign may be reduced to this one decision: act, and risk tearing the fabric of Britain apart. Refuse, and risk the monarchy itself being torn down. That is the brutal reality of this crossroads. So what happens next? Will King Charles shatter tradition to save a nation, or will he gamble that silence and inaction will keep the crown safe? Will we witness the most dramatic assertion of royal power in living memory, or the slow-motion collapse of one of the oldest institutions on earth? The banner on that motorway was just the beginning. The next chapter of British history is about to be written, and it all depends on what one man does in the days ahead. What do you think? Should Charles act, or should he stay silent? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe, because when the king finally makes his decision, you'll want to be among the first to know. The fate of Parliament, the monarchy, and maybe even British democracy itself is hanging in the balance.